Hi there, and welcome. This is the fourth and final lesson on green laws. And before we dive right in, I think it's worthwhile to um, preface with two thoughts. The first is to discuss briefly the need in the Philippines to designate spaces and areas throughout the country solely as places where wildlife, flora, and fauna can grow, and where the rich biodiversity of the ecosystem can be preserved. Okay. Um, Secondly, there is also a need to reserve certain areas exclusively for the environment and to exclude all other forms of land use. Okay, so with these two needs, uh, we are presented with a law that is precisely for this purpose. And this law is the National Integrated Protected Area System Act of 1992, or Republic Act number 7586. So what exactly is this law all about? Okay, well, it's a law that is about establishing the National Integrated Protected Areas System, or NIPAS. The law also defines its scope, the extent of its coverage, okay, and it also is a law that provides for the management of this protected area system. In terms of the purpose, the declaration of policy of the law provides exactly what the purpose is in a broad sense, or generally what the all-encompassing purpose. And let's just read it. Basically, what the declaration of policy is on this law says is that its purpose on securing for the Filipino people of present and future generations the perpetual existence of all native plants and animals through the establishment of a comprehensive system of integrated protected areas within the classification of national park as provided for in the Constitution. So we can see napaka-noble nung purpose na to. Very, very noble. Again, it says to secure for the Filipino people of present and future generations the perpetual existence of all native plants and animals. So very, very powerful. It's not only noble really, but it's also very practical. But before I talk about the practical aspects, it's worthwhile mentioning that ginagawa pa lang tong batas na to, there was already some talks of an international law, that covers essentially the same thing. And when we say international law, ang pinag-usapan naman talaga natin dyan are standards that are created by some international body. An international body like the United Nations. So as I'm sure you are aware, itong mga international bodies na to, they come together to talk about how they should do things, things that would be common to all, and they make them into essentially laws. I mean, they're not really binding laws, but they're laws nonetheless that each one commits to. Okay, just for everyone's benefit. So there was a body, and that put together a convention or a standard specifically for this purpose, and that was the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there were already standards in place before 1992, and so when this law was drafted, it was aimed at compliance to those standards, to the standard provided under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Okay, so when it was passed into law, sometime thereafter, actually, I think right around the time frame that it was passed into law, it was about the same time that Earth Day was happening. So medyo may pagka international exposure, or it was given international attention. So the Philippines was lauded for the passing of this law. But having said that, basically this law fully complies to that convention. So maraming inadopt na provisions um, from that convention. So things that you would find on that convention, you would clearly find here also in the law here, in this NIPAS law. Okay. So having said that, and before I go to the practical aspects, actually, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about the practical aspect. Hindi lang naman kasi, this wasn't just done for the sake of complying to international commitments. Pero may practical purpose talaga to eh. I mean, there are a lot of species that are endemic to the Philippines. And in fact, there's a great many that are also in existence only in the Philippines. So very important na preserve yan, for the future generations. We want to avoid extinction of particular species, especially those endangered species that are native only to, at least in this case, in the Philippines. So there is a need to protect basically their habitats, where they live and where they graze, where they where they survive basically. And so that's what this law aims to do, is to preserve and protect those endangered areas, or areas that it's, and we'll talk about this in a minute, areas called protected areas, where we would find many of these species. Okay, so that's the practical aspect. So having said that, let's see how this law defines in legal terms what a NIPAS system is, a National Integrated Protected Areas System. Okay, so the law says under Section 4, subparagraph 1, that the National Integrated Protected Area System is the classification and administration of all designated protected areas. Okay, so it's the classification and administration. So it's the first identification and classification effort, and as well as administration, or the management, the oversight to ensure it. Okay, and again, it's referring to those classified areas designated as such, which it's referring to as protected areas. Okay, and the purpose behind that is to maintain essential ecological processes and life support systems, to preserve genetic diversity, to ensure sustainable use of resources found therein, and to maintain their natural conditions to the greatest extent possible. So, medyo mouthful siya. Okay? To maintain ecological processes. So, kumbaga yung circle of life, you remember that in Lion King. So, it cannot be broken. It must continue that process, that ecological process, which necessarily includes the life support system. Okay, to preserve genetic diversity. Kasi iba-iba tayo eh. We're very, all species on Earth are very diverse. So there's a need to preserve that. Kasi, maybe there's a possibility na if one is not effectively protected, it would affect the balance in this circle of life. Okay, to ensure sustainable use of resources found therein. So there you have the word again. We've said this a couple of times throughout this module. Sustainable, really, what we're talking about here is just renewable. So magamit siya because we know that resources are used. The law allows for the use of resources, these environmental resources, but only it would only be allowed in such a way na it can be renewed. Hindi yung gagamitin mo and that's the last of it, and we will never see that ever again. It's completely extinct. So it cannot be that way. There has to be some renewable process, some regeneration, or as it relates to forests, reforestation. So that's what we're talking about here when we say sustainable use. So you use it, but there has to be a way that it regenerates. Okay, and to maintain natural conditions to the greatest extent possible. So natural conditions, yung conditions that are native, to a particular species, where it is able to thrive. Okay, so that condition needs to be maintained to the greatest extent possible. So yeah, so very all-encompassing itong legal definition. Okay, so it's very, very broad, not necessarily broad, but it's all-encompassing. Right? Broad is probably not the right characteristic, but better to characterize it as all-encompassing as to what NIPAS is. Okay, so now let's talk about coverage, the extent of the coverage of this NIPAS Act. Okay, the scope. We've already sort of alluded to it, and the scope really is protected areas. Protected areas. Okay, and ang ganda na pagka-characterize ng declaration of policy of the law as to what protected areas is. It says that it's the outstandingly remarkable areas and biologically important public lands that are habitats of rare and endangered species of plants and animals, biological zones and related ecosystems, whether terrestrial, wetlands, or marine, all of which shall be designated as protected areas. So there, a characterization of what would constitute a protected area. Okay, they're outstandingly remarkable areas. Okay, of biological importance. They are public lands. Okay, that's basically lands of public domain. We recall discussing that in our first lesson. Lands of public domain, owned by the state. Okay, and they happen to be the habitats also of our rare and endangered species, not just of plants but also of animals. Okay, so they're referred to as zones. Okay, zones, biogeographic zones. Okay, and they're really ecosystems. Okay, all right. So yeah, ang ganda ng characterization. So outstandingly remarkable. So let's take a look at exactly how it defines protected areas, how this law defines protected areas in a legal way, the legal definition of what a protected area is. And of course, that speaks to the scope of this law, okay, since it focuses on these protected areas. So what it says, and in terms of how it defines what a protected area is, it says that it refers to, or protected areas refers to, identified portions of land and water set aside by reason of their unique physical and biological significance, managed to enhance biological diversity, and protected against destructive human exploitation. Okay, so the first part reiterates their unique nature. Okay, or unique characteristics, and it talks about what part of the entire land it refers to. Okay, so it refers to those portions that are identified, that are designated. Okay, whether it's in land or water, and their designation is based on their unique physical and biological significance, and which is why they are set aside for that. They're set aside for that reason. Set aside meaning they're being protected. Okay, they're being protected for that reason, okay? Or they're being classified, administered for the purpose of protecting them. Okay, so it's because of their unique physical and biological significance. Okay, so and it goes on to discuss that they're being overseen. Okay, they're being managed. Okay, so that it for the purpose of ensuring that ensuring the biological diversity, and of course more importantly to ensure protection against destructive human exploitation. Ayan, destructive human exploitation. Okay, so very important in yan, which in a way, if you look at this, it already tells you na it's for sure it's gonna have some kind of penal provision kasi if the air is human, sabi nga nila, so there's a likelihood that we will unfortunately exploit it, not necessarily for deliberate selfish reasons, but perhaps for other seemingly valid but nonetheless unlawful reasons. Okay. Naisip ko lang just now actually. So medyo commercial muna tayo ng konti. I just want to quickly go back to the characterization that was made in the Declaration of Policy. Yung binasa natin kanina, the one that says to secure for the Filipino people of present and future generation the perpetual existence. Okay. Kung basahin mo talaga yan, it's kind of a legal term or technical term, or you can even call that scientific term, okay, for merong forever, diba? Kasi it's talking about perpetual existence. Perpetual is forever, diba? So, forever for all the Filipinos, okay, for all of the Filipino people of present and future generations. So, na-miss lang ako doon. Okay, I just thought I'd throw that in. Okay, so anyway, let's go back to serious matters. Let's proceed on. Let's talk now about a provision in this law that aims to do what I guess I would refer to as a catch-up. Okay? Kasi bago pa na-pass ng law na to, I mean, hindi naman pwedeng, okay, you pass law, now we're just gonna start classifying, identifying these as protected areas and just begin to do our administration of them. Of course, it doesn't work that way. The Philippines has had many of these already in existence for some time. Okay, and these protected areas were provided for by some law. Okay, so in a way, itong law na to just creates more of a centralized approach. Okay, to classifying these areas and designating them as protected areas deserving of the protection, conservation, administration, all of the things that the law provides to ensure their future existence, their perpetual existence, forever existence. Okay, so there is a provision on this law that catches up, that goes back and essentially provides some way to take all of those that have been designated before by some other law and puts them into the protection of this law. Okay, and the protection or the provision that I speak of reads something like this. This is in the law itself under articles under section 5 subparagraph 1 of the NIPAS Act. Okay, and it says all areas or islands in the Philippines proclaimed, designated, or set aside pursuant to a law, presidential decree, presidential proclamation, or executive order as national park, game refuge, bird and wildlife sanctuary, wilderness area, strict nature reserve, watershed, mangrove reserve, fish sanctuary, natural and historic landmark, protected and managed landscape/seascape, as well as identified virgin forests before the effectivity of this act, are hereby designated as initial components of the system. The initial components of the system shall be governed by the existing laws, rules, and regulations not inconsistent with this act. Okay, so very interesting there. It makes all of those areas that were designated by some other law besides this, okay, it designates them as protected areas that would fall as their initial components of the system. Okay, and that's essentially put into effect upon the effectivity of this law. So when this law was put in place in 1992, from that point forward, absorbed na kumbaga all of these protected areas, areas that are protected by some other law. Okay, they were essentially brought into the control and coverage of this law. Now, an interesting point here that also needs to be mentioned is yung mga catch-up protected areas na yan that were already protected to begin with by some law and are now under the coverage of this law. Okay? Yung pag-absorb or pag-cover ng law na to of those pre-existing protected areas doesn't necessarily mean that, yung I'm gonna take you from there and bring you here. So lahat ng mga protection that you had there before mawawala because everything is now going to be done through here. No, that's not the case. So if you look at the last sentence, this explains that that's not the case. It says, yun nga, yung mga initial components na yun will be governed, or the term used is shall. So talagang mandatory. They'll be covered by those existing laws, rules, and regulations. Okay, for as long as they're not in contradiction, they're not inconsistent with this law. Okay, so benefit yun, parang double coverage, double protection. Okay, so that's the great thing about this, what I call a catch-up provision or catch-up clause. Let us now discuss how this law delivers. Okay, so we'll shift gears here. All right, so I think it's important to first mention that since may catch up provisions that essentially took all of the protected areas, those protected areas that were defined by other laws as such, they were designated as protected areas by those laws. When this law aimed to cover all of those, naturally there already needed to be some category or some placeholder dito sa law na to where it would put them into. Kasi not all protected areas are the same. They have categorization. They categorize them according to their particular characteristics. So it's only natural that this law must first have those categories already in place. And indeed it did. There are a number of them that it created and officially established upon the effectivity of this law. So real quickly, we're just going to go over them. As I said, there's a number of them, so let's take a look at each one of them. So these are the categories of protected areas as provided by this law. Okay. The first one is a strict nature reserve, an area possessing some outstanding ecosystems, features, and/or species of flora and fauna of national scientific importance, maintained to protect nature, and maintain processes in an undisturbed state in order to have ecologically representative examples of the natural. So medyo mahaba-haba to, but essentially, yeah, the law does provide a description. I don't think it's necessary for us to discuss specifics about each of them. We'll just go over and identify what each of these categories are. Okay, so this one is the first one, the strict nature reserve. Let's go to the next one. That's the national park. This is a forest reservation of natural wilderness. Okay, and let's move on to the next one. Again, we're not gonna go over details, but you're certainly welcome to read them. Just look up the law. Okay, but this is the second one. Let's see how many there are. The next one is natural monuments. So this one is for the protection of small features, to protect or preserve nationally significant natural features. Okay. Wildlife sanctuary. Okay, it's an area that assures the natural conditions to protect nationally significant species. Protected landscapes or seascapes. Seascapes, landscapes / seascapes. Okay. Areas of national significance characterized by the harmonious interaction of man and land. Nice. Okay. The harmonious interaction of man. Okay. Next. Resource reserve. Medyo broad yung title na to, so let's just take a quick look as to how it is described. So it's referred to as, or at least it's characterized as, an extensive and relatively isolated and uninhabited area, normally with difficult access, designated as such to protect natural resources. Okay. Let's move on. What else do we have? Natural biotic area. So this is an area set aside to allow the way of life of societies living in harmony with the environment. In natural biotic, so there is that coexistence, so to speak. This is probably common in those cultural communities of the IP, okay, the indigenous people. Okay, so that's it. The last one is sort of a catch-all. Basically, it just says other categories established by law, conventions, or international agreement, which the Philippine government is a signatory. So there's a number of ways that other categories could be named. Okay, so following that train of thought, there is a provision in this law that also talks about adding additional protected areas. Okay, Section 6 actually talks of additional areas to be integrated to the system. Okay, and let's just read it. It says, notwithstanding the establishment of the initial component of the additional areas with outstanding physical features, anthropological significance, and etc., etc. So basically, it's saying that regardless of the establishment of those initial components, okay, there is a provision that allows for the adding of areas that could be integrated into the system. Okay, and sure enough, kasi this is an old law. It's 1992, if I'm not mistaken. So since then, it has been amended, and that amendatory law did not repeal this law. This law is still pretty much in effect, but the amendatory law actually just expanded, and one of the means to expand this law is it added additional areas, the additional protected areas. Okay, that amendatory law is entitled the Expanded National Integrated Protected Area System Act of 2018. So bago pa lang siya. Okay, and it's Republic Act 11038. So logic tells us that if you can add, then you should be able to subtract, right? So this is also true here in this law, in this NIPAS system. Okay, we've talked briefly moments ago about the ability to add new protected areas or add new areas to the designation of being a protected area. Okay, there is a provision in this law that also allows for the ability to de-establish or to take an area out of being designated as a protected area. Okay, the provision of law is Section 7 under this law, the NIPAS law, the NIPAS Act. Okay, and basically it's something that can be done upon extensive review, extensive study. But very important to note that the ability to de-establish as well as the ability to establish is not something that the Secretary of the DNR can do on his own. He is not the final authority. He has no power. He doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the power to actually formally put some area as a designated area as a protected area, nor does he have the power to de-establish a protected area, take an area out of being designated as a protected area. Those powers are legislative in nature. They have to be enacted as laws. So it's the legislative branch of government that has the authority to do that. Okay? Again, they have to be laws. In fact, the amendment, the amendatory law that I mentioned earlier to the NIPAS Act, did add a number of areas as protected areas. So that's probably the best example. Okay, and that's a law. That's an mandatory law. It amended the NIPAS Act. It enhanced it. That's the reason why they call it the Enhanced NIPAS Act. Okay, so there you have it. The ability to add as well as remove an area as a protected area. Okay, and that's a power only with the legislative branch of government to be enacted as law. So now let's talk about the administration and management of this system. Okay, there is a provision in this law that provides for that. The first thing to note as far as this provision is concerned is that it defines, or rather identifies, who is in control of this administration, okay, who has the supervisory control over this administration and management of the system, okay. Basically, it is the SENR, the Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. He is the final arbiter as far as administration and management of the system is concerned, okay. And he actually, or rather, DNR has appointed, assigned rather, the Biodiversity Management Bureau to essentially oversee the day-to-day activities in this space, okay. Now, earlier I said that changes that can be made are only those that the legislative has the authority to do, the lawmakers, okay. Only the lawmakers and their outputs, the laws, are the essentially the final authority when it comes to adding new protected areas, as well as taking out an area from that categorization, from that classification, okay. So, but with everything else, when it comes to administration and management, that falls within the control of DNR. In this case, the head of office is the one that has the legal authority, okay. So let's identify quickly what some of his powers are. The Secretary of Environment and Natural Resources. What are some of his powers related to administering and managing the system? Okay, so he's essentially on the top of the food chain. So he's anything that can be done that does not require law, he can pretty much do anything that needs to be done insofar as administration and management of the system is concerned. This includes the ability to issue system-wide rules and regulations and the implementation of, at least for the purpose of implementing the provisions of this law, okay? So he has the ability to do that. He can also set standards, procedures, and protocols, okay, for the establishment and management of protected areas, including the system, okay? So he can commission studies, he can order zoning, particular zoning. So essentially, all of those activities related to classification of these areas, okay? Just the same to review the characteristics if anything has changed, like what are the plans and projects, including plans and projects, okay, and so forth. So he has those powers. So again, those are administrative in nature, and it also speaks to the management of the system. So he's got power to do those things. Interesting power here. He can actually, since he has the authority to do all of these things, he naturally also has the power to deputize field officers and other technical and support personnel so that he can execute some of the things that are within his powers, okay? So parang ano sila, force multipliers, these deputized personnel, okay? Here's another interesting power that the SENR has in relation to administration and management of the system. He can call on any agency or instrumentality of the government, okay, including the academic institutions, okay, also the non-government organizations, and even the private sector. Whichever is necessary to accomplish the objectives and the activities of the system. All right, so we know that the DNR, the BMB under the DNR in this case, has jurisdiction over the administration and management of the entire system, the entire NIPAS, okay? Now, it's also important to note that this law allowed for the creation of bodies, okay, bodies for each of the protected areas, okay? So that body, or those bodies, are referred to as the Protected Area Management Board. They're boards, okay? So they're kind of a policy-making body, okay? And there is one, as I said, there is one for each protected area, okay? And the composition of this body is kind of like an Avengers type of composition, because it involves quite a number of powerhouse members of government. Okay, so if you look down below on the list, this is essentially who would compose a protected area management board for each area. Okay, so you have the regional director, the DNR regional director for that area, chairing this board, and other participants include politicians. You have the local government, the governors of the provinces, where the protected area is located. Senator also needs to play in, and it's usually a senator that needs to have some nexus to that local area. Maybe he's a registered voter in that area. Okay. Also a congressman, the local executives, namely the mayors. So this is in addition to the governor. Okay. And a whole bunch of others. On the national government side, you have participants, the regional directors of for example, the Department of Agriculture, NEDA, the OST, including law enforcement, PNP, and as well the Department of National Defense. So their regional directors play in to this PAMB. Okay? And of course, we're talking about the regions where the protected area is located. Other members include representatives from either an NGO or a PO. Okay? And also a participant or a representative, at least three. It says at least one, but not more than three. So at least one, but not more than three, from all of the IPs, indigenous people that are present in the area where the protected area is located. Okay. Someone from academia also needs to play in, and one at least from the private sector. Okay, so it's kind of a who's who of real powerhouse members, not only of government but non-government organization, the population for that matter, namely those IPs that are affected, and even the private sector. Okay. So besides the DNR and the PAMB, there is another office that plays in to the administration and management of the protected areas. Okay, this one almost actually has the same jurisdiction as the PAMB. In other words, there is this office for every protected area. Okay. And this office is called the PAMO, or the Protected Area Management Office. Okay, and it is responsible for the day-to-day active overseeing a protected area. Okay, let's just read what it says on the provision of law. There is hereby established a Protected Area Management Office to be headed by a PASU, or a Protected Area Superintendent, with a permanent plantilla position, which shall supervise the day-to-day management of protecting and administering the protected area. Okay, so you have a permanent superintendent, a regular employee of the government. Okay, he also has a staff that are regular employees, and that staff is one that is composed by and designated by the DNR. Okay, so again, this is an office who does the day-to-day management of protecting and administering the protected area. It's headed by a regular employee, a superintendent, and he's got personnel there. Okay, so there you have it. You have essentially a pretty good number of organizations or bodies that are tasked to oversee these protected areas. Okay, so you have DNR, you have the PAMB, and now you have the PAMO. And of course, the legislative branch is also there, purposed on, at least specific to this, purposed on, essentially coming up with the laws to either add or remove an area from the designation of being a protected area. The law also requires that for each protected area, there must be a long-term framework plan, specifically for the management of that particular protected area. And to achieve that, the law requires that there is a management plan. Okay, so there is that provision in law that speaks to the creation of a management plan purposed on ensuring that there is a long-term framework specifically for managing that protected area. Okay, an important note here about this plan is that it has to be in harmony with other laws or other pertinent laws. One is not a law, but it's if you look on the third paragraph there, it speaks to an actual plan, the Ancestral Domain Sustainable Development and Protection Plan, of which this law has to be shall or must be in concert with, or has to be harmonized with that. And that's a plan that is required under a law, Public Act number 8371. So it's not a law directly, but rather a mandate of that law that it has to be in harmony with, the plan that's in that law, that it has to be in harmony with. There are a couple others that also this management plan needs to be, must be in harmony with. The IP Rights Act of 1997, okay, as well as the Local Government Code, Act number 7160. Okay, it has to be, or it must be in harmony with those laws. Okay, this is actually an area, environmental impact assessment. This is something that is not just, I know this is probably the first time I'm raising this in this module, but this actually applies not just here, but in some of the other areas, which I didn't get an opportunity to raise. But anyway, let's talk about it here, and you'll see how it is related or how it is applicable to other areas, other green laws. Okay, environmental impact assessment. Okay, what this is basically is a process. It's a very, very comprehensive, very, very intensive process. Okay, and it's intended to, as the name implies, it's an assessment. Okay, to see if a particular project has any environmental impact. Okay, namely against the protected areas. Okay, if there's for example, there's some development going on, maybe they're building a new mall. Okay, before ground could be broken, parts of the planning activity include this environmental impact assessment. This is a mandate of any developer. Okay. And basically, like I said, it's a very, very intensive process. It's a study. It's a kind of a lengthy study, very scientific, very laborious. It is a study in itself. But anyway, at the end of the day, if the impact assessment, the environmental impact assessment, this is an assessment, so there has to be some kind of an output, okay, that says it will have an impact or no, it will not have an impact. Anyhow, assuming that it's favorable to the applicant, to the developer, okay, then what they are issued with is an environmental compliance certificate. So it's almost like a license that tells anybody concerned that that developer complied with the environmental requirements, that they've actually undergone the environmental impact assessment process and they passed it, and as such they are given the certificate to signify the same. At that point they should be able to proceed with their efforts. Okay, so this EAI, at least as it relates to this law, refers to protected areas. In other words, developments around the area that may impact these protected areas. So in other areas of green laws, you can probably imagine in mining, in the area of mining, there's a need for that, especially for large-scale mining. Okay, so there's a need for before anything can be done. Before the ground is broken, there is need for this assessment to be done. Okay, and ECC issued before actual breaking of the ground. Okay, so let's move on. Now, the provisions of this law also cover respect for existing rights. There's two particular provisions that I'm going to be sharing related to that. This one is on ancestral domains and customary rights. Okay, so the message here is that they must be respected. They have to be accorded due recognition. Okay, these ancestral domains and customary rights. Okay, let's go ahead and just read it just to make sure we don't miss anything about it. Okay, ancestral domains and customary rights shall be accorded due recognition as part of heritage preservation and pursuant to the need to conserve biologically significant areas. The territories and areas occupied and conserved for and by IPs and communities shall be recognized, respected, developed, and promoted. The ICCs and IPs concerned shall have the responsibility to govern, maintain, develop, protect, and conserve such areas in accordance with their indigenous knowledge systems and practices and customary law, with full and effective assistance from the NCIP, okay, the DNR, and other concerned government agencies. A mechanism for coordination and complementation between the indigenous traditional leadership and governance structure and the NCIP, DNR, government agencies, concerned LGUs, and civil society organizations shall be created. So, when it talks about being accorded due recognition, it also, talks about what the responsibilities are in relation to that. The responsibilities of the IPs and the communities, the support that will be provided by government. So this sort of lays the foundation for that. So clearly it talks about conservation of rights, of people that would be affected, okay, by, for example, the establishment of a protected area. Okay, let's move on. The other right is existing rights. Okay, and this pertains to all property and private rights within the protected area and its buffer zones. Okay, those rights, they kind of fit within this mandate if they're already in existence, okay, or have been vested upon, have been vested upon the effectivity of this law. So, it can't be some rights that, which of course probably is not possible. It can't be rights that were acquired after the passage of this law, because the passage of this law essentially already, establishes something that cannot be overcome with something else. So naturally, the rights that's being referred to here are rights that were vested or were already in existence before the passage of this law. Okay, and again, this is on personal and private property rights. Okay, so that is a highlight of what is covered by this law. We were given an opportunity earlier to discuss the rationale. We talked a little bit more about it. We actually uncovered a little bit more detail than what we've done in earlier laws. But nonetheless, I hope you found or actually all of those details that we discussed. I hope you found them useful, informative, and that it gave you ample understanding of the reasoning behind why this law exists. And of course, we got a chance to go over some of the features, some of the provisions of this law that really talks about how it delivers on its objectives. Right? It's not what we went over is really just a highlight. It's not an exhaustive list. It doesn't cover everything, but basically I picked and choose some of the provisions that, in my opinion, would give you enough ideas as to what is covered by this law. Okay, so being that is the case, I think at this point we are ready to move on to the last part of our exploration of this law. And this is, again, a part that is something we've been doing for a while for every one of the laws that we've covered, only because it is the most relevant activity in relation to the objectives of this course. Okay, and that, of course, is looking at the punishable acts, okay, the violations of this law. Okay, and we'll take a look at what the law says about that. There is actually one provision, Section 20, if I'm not mistaken, that enumerates what all of the punishable acts are. So here we have them now on the screen. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 specific acts that are prohibited or criminalized by this law. Okay, they're a little easier to read. This isn't just a title. This is actually it. There are no additional provisions defining them to a greater extent. This is pretty much it. And then there's a separate section, by the way. These are all the acts. They put them all in one section. And then there's a separate section that talks about the penalties, okay, which are in a way kind of low. Medyo mababa yung penalty. Okay. Anyhow, it doesn't matter for this exercise kasi all we're looking to do is determine exactly how these become criminal activity, how they become violations. Okay. And what we look to do here is answer 3 questions, which provide essentially the elements that we need to conclude if it's a violation or not. And of course, we know what those questions are. The first question we ask is, who would be the possible offender to the subject crime or subject provision of this criminal provision? The next question is, what did that person do which constitutes the offense? Okay, and if that act is not by itself enough to be considered criminal, okay, then what else? What other circumstance? What other facts might there be to qualify it as a crime? So there you have it, those 3 questions. Okay, I keep repeating it because it's important for us, so that this is something that you'll be able to memorize and hopefully build upon. All right. So knowing that that's the framework that we're going to be using, let's take a look at this. And like I said, this section is not just a listing, but this is actually it. I mean, this is the definition, very short and sweet. Okay, like let's look at the first one. It is referring to the act only, and the act here is hunting, destroying, disturbing, or mere possessing of any plants or animals or products derived therefrom. When they're saying therefrom, they're really talking about the protected areas. So all of these provisions refer to the protected areas. They could have been committed there, or they've taken something from there, or did something there affected that protected area, something to that effect. So everything in relation to protected areas. So on this first one, when they said derived therefrom, they're referring to a protected area. Okay, so the act here is that of hunting, destroying, disturbing, or mere possessing of the plants or animals or products that were acquired from the protected area. Okay, that's the act. Okay, that by itself, according to the law, is not enough to constitute a crime. What would constitute it as a crime is that if it's done without a permit. Okay, so in other words, the act of hunting, destroying, disturbing, or mere possessing, or taking something from a protected area is not by itself a crime. By its very nature, it could be allowed, or it could be a crime. So we have to come up with a qualifier that makes it a crime. And what qualifies it as a crime is the last part of the sentence, which talks about the need for a permit. So what would make it a crime then is if the person that did the hunting at this protected area did so without a permit. Okay, so that is the qualifier. So we could, again, same exercise. We could do this for all of these, provisions. But what I'm going to do here is I'm only going to do it on 3. I'll pull up my handy dandy worksheet, and try to break out the elements for at least, I think I did 3 or maybe just 2. I'm not sure. We'll see. Okay, let's take a look at the first one. Okay, the first one is the act of hunting. Why is this saying dumping of any waste? Let me see here. Okay, let's go to this one. This one is the oh, sorry, wait a minute. That's right. Okay, let's just look at this one. Okay, this one is letter C, use of any motorized equipment. Okay, so basically, well, first of all, you're seeing that in the provisions, it doesn't say who the offender is. Okay, but we could presume that it's any person. There is no other explanation than it would be. I mean, unless of course there's a specific provision that says, a professional, or rather like an officer of a company or something like that. I think we could conclude that this is referring to any person because they're just talking about the act. Okay, so it's an act that anybody could do. Okay, and that by doing, they could be committing a crime. All right, so in this case, the offender for all of these is any person. Okay, and the act or omission, at least as it refers to C, okay, is the use of any motorized equipment. And again, we're talking about using that motorized equipment within the protected areas. Okay, and what this is saying basically is that it's yes, it's an act, but it may not necessarily be a crime. It could be allowed, or it could be a violation when you do it, when you do that act. So if we read the rest of the sentence, it provides an answer as to which one it is. Okay, it's so the act of using a motorized equipment without a permit from the management board makes it a crime. Is a crime. Okay, so in other words, before anyone could be in the protected area using a motorized equipment, the act of using that motorized equipment within that protected area must be permitted by the management board in order for it to be lawful. Without that permit, it is unlawful, it's a crime, and it's punished under this law. Okay, so having said that, our elements are: the offender is any person, the act or omission is the use of any motorized equipment, and of course it's already given, it's already established that that use was inside the protected area. As I said, all of these things, all of these provisions refer to whether it was done inside the protected area, taken from the protected area, or damage to the protected area. Okay, so anyway, moving forward, offender is any person, act or omission is use of any motorized equipment, and the qualifier, the one thing that makes it a crime, that act of using the motorized equipment, is if it's done without a permit from the management board. Okay, I think I did one more here. Let's take a look. Yes, I did. Anyway, it looks like what I would suggest is there's a number of provisions there. You should by now have mastered what we've been doing. Putting things on a worksheet. That's just my technique that I'm sharing with you. It's up to you if you want to use that. But I would, I'm sharing it with you in hopes that you could, if you're not going to use it, it would at least give you some ideas on how to make it easy for you. Because the idea here is for you to develop that skill. Okay, as it is, medyo, based on what we've seen thus far, sometimes it's easy to determine the elements of an offense. Sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes it requires a little bit more thinking, a little bit more analyzing. But at the end of the day, whatever you can do to make it easy for yourself, the better. Okay, so that is my objective here by sharing this with you, by sharing some of these techniques with you. Okay, so anyway, I would encourage that since we were only able to cover one of the listed or one of the enumerated offenses on your spare time, you may want to go ahead and do these exercises yourself. Okay. Also, I was just reminded by the Secretariat of PCPD that upon my recommendation, I believe they were, hopefully they did anyway. So in any case, I hope this makes sense when I say it. I believe they handed to you a hypothetical case, okay, a hypothetical case on green laws without any instructions, and that's okay. because I think you'll sort of have an idea upon reading it what you might be interested in doing with that hypothetical case. At some point, I will communicate with you exactly what our objective in that hypothetical case is, why we're sharing it with you, and what we're going to do with it. Okay, so at some point, maybe before the start of the next module, or maybe even while we're doing the studies or the lessons on that next module, we'll take a break and discuss exactly what we're going to do with this with that hypothetical case that I'll send your way. Okay, so anyway, at this point we're pretty much done with lesson 4, and being that this is the end or the last lesson to this module, we are essentially done with green laws. So we're about ready now to proceed to the next module. This next module is actually a little shorter, so I believe, considering the troubles that we've had, technical troubles lately, I think maybe the Secretariat is going to make the next module available next week, along with, I don't know yet, but that's my theory, that they're gonna incorporate it or include it with the other module. Since this next module, module 2 on blue laws, and module 3 on brown laws, they're relatively short modules. They cover less laws. Itong first one that we did is green laws. Medyo mahaba-haba to. We were talking about 6 laws. And as it is, I've already summarized as much as I can, so we're not getting too deep and ending up with a much longer session. So there's 6 laws on green laws, but for blue laws, which is the next module, it only covers 2 laws, so it's relatively short. The next one is the brown laws. I believe there's only 3 laws there, so a total of 5 laws. Okay, versus the 6 laws on green laws. Okay, so again, I'm theorizing anyway. Don't quote me, but I'm just thinking, especially considering how troubling it is to, overcome some of these technical challenges in uploading these videos. By the way, we're having to split them up in smaller chunks, so that added to the time. So anyway, considering all that trouble, I'm theorizing that just to make it so you're no longer troubled, you're no longer having to wait, that those would all be made available, at least the 2 modules, the module on blue laws and on brown laws, that they will be presented or made available together next week. That's my theory. Okay, so anyway, I think at this point I'm gonna close off. Again, this is the end of lesson 4 and the end of the discussion and lessons on green laws. So this is a milestone. We're now ready to move on to the next module. So having said that, thank you for listening, and looking forward to talking again, and hopefully at some point being able to interact with you, okay, on this entire program. So looking forward to that, and for now, goodbye and talk to you soon.